I think the irony of the situation is many of our MPs who were sitting in the National Assembly were students themselves who were involved in the many uprisings that we experienced in South Africa and should know the power of a student movement.
Well, you're right. There was sort of super symbolism really about yesterday, and it really recalled South Africa's past and how students were the vanguard of the struggle against the apartheid regime. In a strange way, may I just add, yesterday was the commemorative anniversary of the Back to the Future movie, and how strange it was that we had a Back to the Future scenario play itself out on the streets of Cape Town yesterday. And I think, yes, this symbolic historical linkage between students, student protest, and a government that is not responsive or else fails to provide adequate leadership is simply coming home to roost in the new South Africa. And it's part and parcel, I think, of a questioning of the efficiency of the ruling party, and I might add, can contribute to incremental losses of support for the ANC going forward.
Let's speak about the increases issue. We know that Minister Nene has set aside 11 billion rand to go to higher education. On the one hand, we have that. On the other, we have universities who wanted to propose a 10% increase. Now, as students protest the issue, where should South Africans be looking? Should we be looking at Minister Nene's allocation? Should we be looking specifically at the universities who are increasing fees? Where do we look?
Well, look, I have some sympathy with universities because they have to run a business, they have to pay staff, and it's a costly exercise as input costs have risen. And input costs, not just in terms of salaries, but in running costs, have risen substantially in South Africa. So there is budgetary pressure on universities. There's also budgetary pressure on the national fiscus. And again, if you're only going to grow at less than 1.5% per annum, you are going to struggle to get the necessary revenues from a tax base that's far too small in South Africa. And Minister Nene effectively admitted that in the budget. So you caught here in terms of trying to find the necessary resources, but at the same time suffer through an ailing and lagging economy. And when, I must tell you, the minister announces that he has to make an additional allocation of some 60 billion rand, as he announced yesterday, for public servant salaries, because you don't want to upset the public servants in advance of a local government election next year, those allocations within the national fiscus very often, I'm not saying all the time, but very often have a political motivation to keep people relatively happy. And as a result, something's got to give. So allocations to other necessary departments sometimes take a back seat. All I can say is that this is an issue that's been with us for some time, the issue of student fees. And in defense of Minister Nzimande, this is an issue that his department has investigated. And in fact, they have discussed, I think, to some degree, issues surrounding the budget allocations. But the downside is that his office has done nothing about this particular crisis. So we've all been well aware of this for some time, but when there's inaction, it's going to boil over into frustration, and populist frustration in a sense, on the streets.
Which is what we're seeing at the moment.
Yeah, yes. Well, we're seeing students in a difficult position. They're not quite sure who to really attack, who's really to blame for this crisis. At the beginning of the protest movement, it seemed as though students were taking vengeance against university administrations. But from a political point of view, we've seen a shift over the course of the last few days where students have taken the battle directly to government. And I think this poses an interesting shift in how students are assessing where the blame lies. Look, I think all parties are going to need to come to the table in the end to try and find some sort of solution. But ultimately, it is government's responsibility not to reduce allocations as they have done over the last number of years, at least to keep them at a fairly steady level. But that depends on healthy economic policies in South Africa, which we haven't had.